As our panelists actually emphasized, clearly it seems that we are losing the momentum for the global trade. Maybe losing TPP is not a single incident. It is probably the blocking the whole chain reaction for the global trade liberalization. Do we have any alternative then? That probably will be a big challenge for us. As Simon in the morning session emphasized, we have observed many new types of protectionist measure imposed by G20 countries. It may not be the decisive factor, as Professor Douglas Irwin explained, to kill the global trade, but it may be the tipping point, the triggering event for the tipping event for the global trade to lose significantly the momentum in the coming years, unless we find another very important new platform or new dynamics for the global trade. I'm not sure whether our next agenda, digital trade, can be another solution to make a path through for the global trade, but we'll discuss in the next session. Before we hear from our panelists, we can invite some comments from the floor. Please raise your hand if you have any questions or comments, then identify yourself. Let me start with Simon and the gentleman over there.
Yes. Simon Evenet from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. So I'd like to pick up on your last observation, Tukan, which is surely the question we should ask after the failure of the Doha round, TPP's demise, TTIP is on its last legs, the difficulties doing the EU-Canada deal is, are free trade agreements still a viable way, politically viable way, to undertake reform in countries? Our Japanese colleague said that she wants to use these agreements as a mechanism for doing reforms. But this only works if everyone wants to reform at the same time, and we don't seem to see that amongst the big players. So maybe this vehicle, which has been useful for the last 20 years in getting a lot of reform done in countries, is no longer politically viable, in which case the emphasis has to go back to unilateral reform, and we have to make the case at home for doing reform on that. Is this the right interpretation of the recent events? Thank you.
Points well taken. The gentleman back there.
Thank you, Professor An, and all the panelists for excellent presentations. My name is Chang Ho Song, Deputy Director from Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea. I'll make my query short. Knowing that NAFTA is now 22 years old, I'm wondering if there's any NAFTA-specific elements that need to be upgraded. I understand a couple of panelists have mentioned that there has been improvements using the mechanism of TPP, but knowing that the TPP has elements of 12 nations, it had to be diluted if there's any specific NAFTA-specific elements between Mexico, United States, and Canada. So I'm wondering if there's any talks among the U.S. academia, and if I have the honor, if the Ambassador Rodriguez was also comment on it, and if my points had any relevance for the upcoming, if there will be any under the Trump administration regarding the renegotiation being opened. Because I feel this is sort of a litmus test that can be used for the prospect of TPP in the future. I have another question for Mr. Powers. I've seen the Excel sheet in the, this booklet that's given to me. Under the tables for manufacturing, natural resources, and energy effects on TPP, on employment levels, every statistics show negative levels, which I feel vindicates what Mr. Trump has been saying about the rape of the U.S. economy by the TPP. So I'm just wondering whether this statistics has any, how does it connect with Mr. Trump's allegation about the effects of job-killing nature of TPP? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments or questions from the floor? Just one more, okay.
My name is Choi Beng-il, professor at Ewha Women's University. I have two questions. One set of questions is to my Australian or Mexican friends. Because of U.S. almost determination to declare TPP is dead, people's speculating possibility of TPP among 11 countries without U.S. But my personal view is that is not going to be politically feasible. But I'm asking my Mexican colleague and Australian colleague, is that going to be politically doable? And also, what is going to be kind of impact? And another question is going to Professor Fukagawa. In that case, is Japan considering to make bilateral FTA with the U.S.? Suppose there will be U.S.-Japan FTA. Is it going to be something, replication of what Japan negotiated in context TPP, or there will be some new issues in bilateral context, or that it will be politically doable? Questions.
Last question back there, the lady.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm February from Sogang University. Actually, I already graduated. I just want to ask Professor Chong. I'm wondering, could you explain a bit more how come you came up the idea of the Korean, Japan, Korea trilateral agreement? Because for the past few years, we just talk about CGK, and as Professor Yukiko said, is that agreement still far behind others' agreement? And could you explain a bit more and why you came up with that kind of agreement? But because kind of interesting, and maybe if it happens, maybe later CGK could be ratified, and Korean-Japan bilateral FTA also could be ratified as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We will now invite our speaker and panelists to respond to the question and any other remaining issue. We will go in the presentation order. So let me start with Simon.
I'm going to address 2 points that I don't know if they were directed at me, but I have thoughts on. So first, Simon, you pointed out how awful things have been in recent years, and the Doha demise and the TPP falling apart. And so you asked, are FTAs still politically viable as a way to do reforms? Here, what I want to do is express a little bit of sympathy with some of the globalization critics who point to, I think, aspects of free trade agreements where the benefits are not clear and there may be some harms. And so I'm just going to mention 2 where I have some sympathy with the critics, which is intellectual property protection and ISDS. Clearly, some of the criticisms are exaggerated, but I think there is something real to some of them. And so what I wanted to say here is, I think FTAs are politically viable, but we need to think carefully about what should be in them. And so I think if you had sort of a simpler, narrower FTA, it would be a lot less controversial. So you look at the example of the Canada-EU trade agreement, there's a lot of focus on investor-state dispute settlement or the EU's proposed reform to it. I question the value of this in a trade agreement, and I would like to see what happened if we had one without that kind of provision in it. Maybe it all would be viable if we, took out a couple provisions. Maybe not. I can't say for sure, but I think it's a possibility. Second point, on the question about NAFTA and specific reforms, again, it's very speculative as to how NAFTA might be reformed. There hasn't been a lot of clarity from the Trump team about what they would like to see changed. I think there's a leaked memo from some Trump advisor. I don't know if the rest of the Trump people support it or not, mentioning things like labor and the environment and country of origin labeling and value-added taxes. But I think this is just sort of the initial talk of what might be involved. I don't know what they will actually end up pushing for. I've heard kind of mainstream people talk about NAFTA and say, look, it was written in the late 80s, early 1990s. Of course it needs to be updated. There was barely an internet back then. Certainly we could go take a look at the services provisions and think about whether there are new services liberalization aspects that we could add into it. But unfortunately, it's just, it is a bit speculative, but you can imagine that as part of this NAFTA renegotiation process, people put some thought into how you could make the NAFTA better, and in doing so, whatever they come up with could be translated and extended to other agreements as well, like the TPP.
I think Japan's probably the major, at this moment, position is to keep this pact as viable as possible, so that in the meantime, probably U.S. is going to change the mind and we'll be able to come back. But and also we are closely cooperating with Australia or Mexico or other countries how to deal with it, how we should decide without U.S. pact will be politically also viable for many other countries. But if all the things are just left as it is, probably, well, if U.S. really wish to have some bilateral one rather than the multilateral one, maybe we should go. But even if in that case, probably Japanese major interest is very much like will be going more to the investment or service kind of things, not be a tariff of hard manufacturing, because the Japanese, probably the big deal is the how we import the U.S. agricultural goods and the how U.S. is going to defend the automobile industries from Japan. But actually, the autos produced in Japan is very small in terms of productions. So even a Honda, for example, they are producing only 3% of the whole productions inside Japan. So that's why Japan is so much sticking to the value chain in the whole world. And we are going to negotiate with this with Mr. Trump, probably.
Yeah, I would like to address the first three questions. I mean, the question about whether the FTAs are the vehicle to keep improving the international rules for trade. I would say that they are a very feasible rule, a very feasible vehicle. However, we should also remember that FTAs have also been rebaptized recently. When we speak about RCEP, there's another title, Comprehensive Economic Partnership. If we look at the bilateral relations, for example, between Mexico and several partners, we have a special association with the European Union. We have strategic associations with other countries. We have comprehensive strategic partnerships with others. So there is a variety of titles that we could use. And what is different in the new agreements with regards to original FTAs is that more and more we're trying to cover a more comprehensive agenda that is not only related to trade, but it covers more other disciplines having to do with the development agenda, at least in how we in Mexico see international partnerships and cooperation. Now, whether the TPP is feasible without the United States, we believe that it could be, and that we should push for it, so that in the eventual reconsideration of the United States, the disciplines are there. And in the case of Mexico, if the Senate approves the agreement, then that will become the new norm for Mexico to apply in future international trade negotiations, either bilateral or multilateral. So we will continue pushing for this, for the eventual implementation of TPP, even if that comes under a new name. I mean, we are not saying that this should be exactly what it is today. So we're open for that reconsideration. About possible specifics in terms of NAFTA and NAFTA reconsideration, I agree that there are things that are already overcome, that we have accomplished in the last 22 years among the three members of NAFTA. If we were to look at the agenda for the future, I think that even if this is not the official position, in Mexico we have been discussing about how to better manage the border, but this means opening up the border, not closing the border more. We need to look at the transportation rules. We need to look eventually at immigration. So this is not the ideas that are on the other side mind, but I think that we should look for these and other matters, like how to improve e-commerce services. I mean, there is there's a long list of possible themes to be included. I have to say, nonetheless, that all of them are already included in the TPP. And we have to remember that any mega FTA is the set of new rules, but the big bulk of the agreement is thousands of pages of the cross concessions among the members, and the TPP has 5,000 pages That means that there have been a lot of negotiations about how we should reconsider the future of trade among NAFTA members and also between these members and the other side of the Pacific. And I think that the negotiations have already made a very good progress in which should retake that in the near future for any eventual reconsideration.
Thank you. I'll take the second question first, which is, could an 11-man TPP work, and particularly for Australia? Let me stress that as a university professor, I can speak as a private Australian citizen, though not for the Australian government. Though I can also report that today, yesterday, the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties of the Australian Parliament has tabled its ratification report into the TPP, which recommends its ratification and clears the way for that to go ahead in the next Parliament process that we have. And what that report found, which what trade policy analysts in Australia already knew, was that our country's reform cost from joining the TPP was extraordinarily low. A lot of the requirements, particularly in the regulatory WTO plus space that we've talked about, Australia was already compliant with, or 95% of the way there prior. So the cost of ratifying the TPP for Australia is pretty low, and in my private view, Australia could, should and possibly will do so, sans the United States. Whether others would be likely to do that's a more open question, particularly if you look at a Vietnam or a Malaysia, where a big part of the sell was the pull of access to the US market. Taking the US out of the equation really changes the way they think about it. So while that might be a yes for an Australia or Japan, whether the other 11 are going to think the same way is another matter. And finally, for Professor Everett's question of can it work, one of the things we've seen in some of the recent trade agreements is an awful lot of trade policy ambition. Extremely high bars set in TPP, TTIP, you could possibly even argue DDA. And when you look at the bilateral agreements we've seen, yes, they've posed this spaghetti noodle bowl problem, and they've got much lower reform ambitions, but they've basically worked. And you could say that there's almost an element of kind of running before you were walking with some of these big agreements, is that they've tried for a lot and they've run up against domestic vetoes. TPP exemplifies that, TTIP's current status does as well. And so my argument would be, yes, it could if we try to walk first.
Okay, well, I think we're going over time, so I'll limit myself to just one of the answers. And I think it's an excellent question. Does the fact that we see negatives in employment in some manufacturing sectors indicate that this is a bad deal for U.S. manufacturing, or does it validate what Trump is alleging, that this is a bad deal? And I just want to put that into context, and I would have put this in more context if I'd been able to do the whole presentation. But so if you see a 0.2% decline in employment, it's important to remember that that's a small decline, and that's relative to probably a potential 30% increase. So in some sense, you've got employment growing at 29.8% over the next 15 years instead of 30%. But that doesn't change the things that's less. Now, some sectors you'll notice are specifically hurt. Titanium, we are reducing a fairly high tariff on titanium, and so that hurts the domestic industry in manufacturing. And some sectors are specifically benefited, apparel and motor vehicles. But for the most part, there's just not that much change to U.S. manufacturing under this deal. And if you look abroad, we have a slide, take a look at slide 6. On page 95, you could see that, in fact, there's just not a lot of tariffs to be reduced abroad in manufacturing. And that contrasts pretty sharply to the tariffs that are coming down on agricultural goods. And it also contrasts pretty sharply to some of the cuts in services barriers. So what you actually see in those negatives, except for a few instances like titanium, is a change that's driven by the fact that resources are diverted into agriculture in the United States. Resources are diverted into services. That means that there's just fewer resources left to go into manufacturing. And so the declines in nearly all the manufacturing sectors you see are driven by what a general equilibrium effect, the fact that the U.S. has limited endowments, and not for the fact that it's actually bad for U.S. manufacturing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking me that question. Why Korea-Japan-US FTA I proposed to the Korean government? Okay, under two assumptions. First, Korea wants to join TPP. I mean, not now, but in any form. And I know that Korea has been supporting the success of TPP and showed interest already in 2014. And then another thing is that if Korea is willing to negotiate an FTA with Japan, so if both are true, then we can think of getting some benefit out of pursuing this Korea-Japan-US FTA, because TPP is basically built on the cross FTA, and US and Japan already negotiated bilaterally under the TPP setting. So if there's going to be some kind of the different setting and an opportunity for Korea to do this kind of the negotiation with Japan, probably it's a little bit lower cost for Korea to do this trilateral than the Korea-Japan FTA, considering the political issues and so on. So by establishing this new trilateral FTA with including United States, maybe we can pursue this with the CJK in tandem, just like the TPP and RCEP. Instead of competing with each other, they could be complementary. So if we build this Korea-Japan-US FTA, probably they can play as a important platform for the future of the trading system in the Asia Pacific.
Thank you very much. We are encountering unprecedented situation now. Right now, too much things are uncertain, too much things are at stake. But this situation highlights the imminent need for collective efforts and wisdom to protect the world trading system. I believe the discussion at this session can be an asset for this endeavor. Please join me thanking our panelists for their excellent insight and opinions.